All right, welcome back to the second half of the special podcast on the G20, which happened in Hamburg. We're going to be now starting a discussion, asking some questions about the media presentation of the protests, whether violence is justified at protests, and also discuss the response from the left, political handling of the G20 protests, the police and parties. So, we just had a wonderful rundown from Sean of what actually happened in the Schanze, which was the center of most of the violence. And I think it's very good to start from here. What was the media presentation of the protests? And I want to start with one thing that I learned today, which was, that you go into Facebook or Twitter to discuss the protests. There are different opinions, and lots of people are always saying, well, they were throwing Molotov cocktails at the police. And I looked.
Well, in the Mopo.
I'll get to this. Yeah. I looked for video evidence of throwing Molotov cocktails at the police, and you'd think there was a lot. The number of times it was mentioned, you think there's a lot, but actually it all goes back to one video. And this is a video taken from a police helicopter. It is in infrared, so thermal video. And it's of a rooftop where there are clearly people throwing stuff down at the police, so it's not non-dangerous. And then there's one instance where someone is lighting something. You can see the lighter turning on, and he's having a lot of trouble, or she is having a lot of trouble, and then finally it gets lit, and then you see this little ball of fire thrown at the police, but nothing happens.
It lands on one of these water cannon trucks. Okay. And essentially it does not really explode.
Okay, well, I'm hearing several things. Navas, you mentioned the Mopo.
Yeah, Mopo today got an interview from a guy who studies thermodynamics, and he said, well, if you look at the infrared image of that thing, the amount of heat that is coming from that firecracker, as he calls it, is not anywhere close to the sort of heat that a Molotov cocktail would generate. So that's absolutely inaccurate.
My information was that from this particular rooftop, which was just one, and it took the police something like half an hour to get up there to find the people and catch them. They were just throwing stones and stuff like that. So that was also the information which was published. There's one particular video where it is shown from the crowd of the police, so it's like inside of the police, and people are actually throwing something which is exploding around the police. Not really inside of them, but like around. So that happened, but that was like on the street with people who were like standing exactly in front of the police officers.
Okay, I don't want to cast doubt on whether there were Molotov cocktails. I think it's very likely that in such a huge protest, such a sort of chaotic protest, there could have been Molotov cocktails, and yet I do wonder at the lack of video evidence for this. I didn't find a single video.
But the underlying question for me, though, is, do you guys think that there were protesters there who were actually trying to kill police officers? Because for me, that's not an easy question to know the answer to. Were they really? Were people trying to have a violent protest, or were they actually trying to, let's say, murder somebody? Because honestly, if that really happened, and supposedly if you drop a Molotov cocktail on someone's head, no matter what riot gear they have, you could potentially kill them. So was that the intent? Was that the intent of some protesters?
It's weird to have guesses around that.
I'm gonna ask that we discuss this later, because right now we are talking about media presentation of the protests. I think the consensus is that the media, at this round table that we have right now, is that the media presentation of the protests was very biased. They showed almost all violence. I've talked to people from outside of Germany who were, looking at the news, and they didn't hear at all about the peaceful protests. Like we said, there was a protest on Saturday. 100,000 people showed up to this protest, at least. Completely non-violent, really wonderful protest, in fact, and
Zero media,
or negligible. Statistically, what's the word? Statistically insignificant. Right. So.
But I guess that's one of those problems with media. In journalism school, I was taught that if a dog bites a man, that is no news. But if a man bites a dog, that is the news, right? So if there's expectations that there's going to be protests, and if the protests go peaceful, nobody talks about that. There was, I think, within German media, there was a coverage, because this was again the evening right after the major incidents in the Schanze. So a lot of German media did cover this. Local German media did cover this. But definitely not a lot of international media. New York Times ran, a front page story about the fact that, what happened in Hamburg, right? And the next day, boom, nothing.
Yeah. I teach English here, and I go to companies, and I teach adults English, and all week we've been talking about the G20 because current events and all that, and we live in Hamburg. But I was surprised at how many people of my students who live in Hamburg, they also had no exposure to the peaceful part of the G20 protests. I had students that were really sad that Hamburg had become so violent, and then afterwards thanked me for telling them about the peaceful parts, because they thought it was only violent. And I really tried to explain to them, no, I'm sorry, there were lots of peaceful protests on every day for 3 or 4 days, and in the end they said, wow, I'm really glad that you told us about that.
See the previous part of our podcast for all of these peaceful protests. Every single one of them was actually peaceful. Even the Welcome to Hell one, it only became violent after it was broken up.
Yeah. And I think it's really negligent of the media not to cover these peaceful things. And I understand that, of course, violence sells. It's sensational. People read it, they want to see it. But on the other hand, I think it's the responsibility of the media to talk about the 100,000 people who protested in Hamburg non-violently for 3 days. To only show one side of it, to only show the violence, it seems to somehow it conflates the small number, the comparatively small number of violent protesters with all of the left. The vast majority, 99,000, were totally peaceful. And when you conflate those two groups together, it discredits the left generally, and it discredits what these peaceful protesters were protesting. And I think that is unacceptable. I think that that was the more important story, was the 100,000 people protesting peacefully for things that they are very passionate about.
I think to go on this point that you're making, it's very important to say that what happened in the media was that everything was focused on the violence and not at all on the reason of these protests. And the reason of these protests were the G20. And really, we shouldn't be having this podcast right now. We should be having a debate on the things that happened at the G20, right? But unfortunately, instead of it being sort of represented as a protesters versus G20 politics scenario, it's a protesters versus police scenario. And unfortunately, because the media has presented it so badly, that's why we feel compelled to do this.
I think this whole situation of putting violence in the whole protest is a very welcoming situation for the media and the politics itself, because it distracts you so much from the content which the G20 has been about. I really understand that people are trying to put things in a more serious way by putting violence in it. When you see a peaceful protest of happy people dancing around, or you see very aggressive people covered in black doing aggressive actions, you have the feeling that these aggressive people are having a reason to act like that. So I understand people who feel like putting this kind of stuff into media, but it's such an unfortunate thing for the content of the G20 outcome.
I think that I agree with the critique of the media that they get distracted and they want the violence and they need to sell, that they're in a for-profit business, and the thing is they need something controversial, and the thing with the violence is that it is very controversial. How do the police respond? And that's been the story, at least in the local Hamburg news, for the last 4 or 5 days, and it's not going to stop for the next weeks, months, possibly years. Even in the international media, it's a story to have the controversial tactics of the police under the microscope. Now imagine a situation where there were no violent protests, or things stayed relatively calm, or nothing was particularly unusual. Imagine the media did cover that story and announced that there was 100,000 people and this was their protest and this was their slogan. You would have a 10-second story, and the story would be over very, very quickly.
Yeah.
They might mention it in passing as the 10th story in the evening news.
Yeah, that's a good point.
But if there's nothing controversial, it won't be the top story, and there won't be enough content to that story. It'll be it'll be a snippet, and it won't be a discussion.
This is going into the is violence is justified part of our question. So if anyone wants to go in,
I have a quick response to add on to what Sean was saying. And I think that's absolutely right. But I think that also really highlights. Everybody talks about how the media is biased and it's propaganda and it's all these things, and we like to say this, but maybe we don't oftentimes get concrete examples because most of us are far enough removed from the events that we trust the media enough to they paint a picture of the event. But we were in Hamburg, so we saw the peaceful things. So we have firsthand experience of how the media operates, and the kind of propaganda that is delivered to us through the media. And maybe they're doing it to sell stories because, true, you're right. I mean, if it was a peaceful protest only, it would have been a 10-second story. So maybe they're doing it for certain reasons, but they definitely, we see that the media is manipulating or coloring these events. Because
I don't trust the media. Man.
Yeah, we always say don't trust the media, but here's a concrete example from my own personal experience now. Why not to trust the media?
I think that's a very good point that Charles made over there. That now the fact that we experience this thing firsthand and we can question this, but I think what is also happening over here is that the interests that the media is serving, they had really nothing to show from the summit. I mean, the fact that there's nothing substantially being covered within the summit, right? That the only news that we've heard in all major international media outlets was just the protests, except for the fact that Trump left his daughter in his chair for a while, right? I think that was the only other non-violent part of the protest that was covered.
There were a few other things, but essentially.
Yeah, this is what I'm saying. Essentially, this also tells you the flop that the summit was, right? And that it was and there was nothing else that they could sell about. The fact that you brought about these 20 people, right, to negotiate something better for Africa, better for Tail, better for climate, and I think also pressing issues in international politics. There was no major breakthrough on any of these things. So what do you report? But you still have 3,000 journalists that you are giving VIP access to, who've got their 28 euro schnitzels covered by their companies. They would work for something. What do? They cover the protests.
Yeah.
Well, I think this is a good point to go into the next question of our podcast, which is whether violence is a justified means of protest or whether violence at protests is ever justified. We are of different views here at the Moral Economy. We did want to have sort of a debate, but although I think we could just leave it as a discussion right now. And so does anyone want to jump in? Immediately?
I'll start.
So I will start.
I think that violence is not an acceptable way of protesting.
Okay, I disagree, so I'll be next.
Okay, I think that it's counterproductive. My main criticism of the violence is that it's counterproductive for the aims that the left sets for the explicit aims of the left, because the left positions itself against a police state, against oppression, against the violence of the state. And I think that when the left protests violently, they give the state a really good justification for increasing police budgets and cracking down on the left and increasing the police state aspect of the state that we live in. This is my main criticism.
I agree with Chell on all of his points, and I also think
I won the debate.
I think specifically in these protests, violence was not justified at all. I mean, what we had was an international incident. You know, it's the G20. Everyone's looking at Hamburg. They're looking at us, and so we should sort of set an example for how protests can be. However, I do want to say I think violence can and is justified in many protest situations, and we don't have to go to like countries where people are very oppressed, like in Turkey with the Kurdish movement, or in many South American countries with the indigenous movements there that are against the destruction of their forests and whatnot. We can also say that here within Europe, it can be justified because it does. I think we've made this point in the previous part. It does present, or it does catch attention for what people are protesting about. And my argument here is also that if you are looking at Hamburg and you see what happened in Hamburg, and you're in another city, and you know something that's going to happen like this, like a G20 summit or something like that, and you're going to go and protest against it, then you at least know that, well, this is an option. This violence is an option. And that's, you might not want to take that option, but also the other side knows that this is an option, and they have to be able to deal with that as well. Are they going to go in like the police did in Hamburg, who I think there's almost a consensus that it was the police who escalated the situation in Hamburg, right? It's almost unanimous, and yet, and I'll just finish up. And so all these other places, we'll look at that. Do we want to handle it that way? And
yeah, so I think what has happened, I'm from Hamburg, I'm a German, that's why my English is so crazy. So we have the 1st of May every year. So we're protesting every year. All the Hamburgers are coming here to protest, people from Flensburg. Yeah.
Just quickly, for our American listeners, 1st of May is it's Labor Day.
Yeah, it's the Labor Day.
It's the 1st of May is the European Labor Day. It actually originated in the United States. It's weird. It's complicated.
New York and Chicago.
So yeah. Okay.
It's a very nice day, however. So we're
to be in Hamburg.
To be in Hamburg, to be in Berlin, to be in bigger cities. So a lot of people come to protest for labor rights. And so we have that every year. And what happens at the 1st of May is that people go to Sternschanze, so what we just heard about from Sean, and they riot, and they're also aggressive sometimes, so there are fights, and there's always like one specific bank which is going to be destroyed. Everybody knows the bank is handling that in a pretty nice way, like, okay, tomorrow we're going to be gone, we're going to build it up again, it's all fine, it happens every year. So what happened this time at G20 is that the protests and the violence was really uncontrolled and totally different than it usually was. And by this I think you can see that this riot culture, which comes from the southern countries, which are a lot more oppressed than Germany, of course, came to Germany and did their thing, how they're used to it, in Hamburg, which is a city which is basically pretty much controlled. So that is the shocking thing about it. And that's why it's reported so much, because it's something which is really unused for us.
Yeah, unusual.
Unusual, exactly.
Yeah.
So I don't think, I really have to disagree just quickly with Andrew, because he said that the violence is showing what people are protesting about, and I think that exactly the opposite is the point, because there's no content in violence. It's just like, I'm against something, but
I want to just respond to that and correct. I don't think it's showing what we're actually talking about. I'm just saying that I think it shows that there's an option on the table that will happen. But I still abhor the violence that was happening.
Yeah, but I think, I mean, I'm not a Hamburger. I'm not from Hamburg, but I've lived in Hamburg for 4.5 years. And from what I know, I'm a professional tour guide. And from what I know about Hamburg's history, that it was always a rebel city. All
That's true.
fucking ways, right? So it was never the sort of, I mean, we've had the first instances of, you know, the first instance of rebellion in the city date back to 1190, when the city was, in the modern historical sense, founded. Right? It was not a popular protest, but still, you know, what you could have much before the Magna Carta came in Britain, right? Now, which is what I would, you know, disagree with what Jana just said, in the sense that, you know, we have a peaceful culture, we're a city that's largely under control. Yes, the city's largely under control, but this was not just this city. G20 has global repercussions, and in that sense, it has to send a global message, and which is what, you know, Andrew was talking about, that since I think 2001, when the last G20 summit was held in Genoa, much before that, the WTO summit in '99 in Seattle, you know, a lot of people look at the Seattle protest, for example, as, you know, giving a new culture to public protests and just, you know, public politics, that people are capable of, you know, shutting down cities, of, you know, violence. Of course, now we are right now engaged with the question of violence. I think violence permeates our lives. You know, it's just that one side of the violence is recognized. We accept it. We accept when a policeman gives us the hand, tells us to stop, we stop it. You don't, and there's of course the wheeled threat of violence. You don't stop, you could probably be shot at. You know, something could have been done. But because that does not happen, most of us submit to the law, right? So that is the structural violence that we are all subject to. We never question it. We never even ask about it. This was the case over here, for example. These folks asked the police that, you know, there's not equality in law. We're not allowed to cover our faces, but you are. A reasonable argument.
Just on novices, a note. Usually we do have Eddie here. Unfortunately, he cannot be with us right now. But he is he made a point very close to novices, and
that was my point. He did not make it. It was my point.
It's not my point.
I totally agree on that.
I'll say the point, and maybe you can claim it or not. And it was he was talking to his. He's a tour guide. He was talking to tourists, or maybe he's also an English teacher like Chell, so he might have been talking to his students, but it doesn't matter too much. They were discussing violence in the capitalist system, and Eddie made, I think what's a very good point is that, you know, one sign of violence, that the structural violence that we have, is that most people cannot even think of an alternative to the capitalist system.
Yes.
And that is the structural violence, you know, that we're not even capable of thinking this.
Exactly. And this is just one aspect of violence. I mean, there's ideological violence.
Yeah.
You know, that you cannot even call somebody a socialist in the United States. I mean, that is like something you just cannot say.
Yeah, you can't
right?
even say it. Yeah.
No matter what that means. It is just that ideological violence that you're subject to. Violence has many forms, right? Physical violence is something I also resist. But I think we should also be aware, at least recognize the structural violence that permeates our lives. The fact that you cannot cross a line where it's written "Do not cross this line" is a form of violence.
So I have a couple points I want to make just from this discussion. So Andrew, you talked about the fact that it's almost universally said that the police were sort of the ones that instigated it, or the ones that sort of started things, so that they
escalated.
It escalated, sure. Yeah. It's very interesting because we were talking about the media's response, and there was almost universal praise in the local media for the police, and the headline said, "Thank you to the police from all over Hamburg." Lots of businesses have offered these police officers, which, by the way, came from not just Hamburg, but all over Germany and even from all over Europe. Businesses have offered them to come visit our beautiful city, and thank you so much, and you can stay in our hotel for free for a weekend, and so on. The media's portrayal is that we should be very thankful, regardless of the fact that at the same time they're responsible for a lot of the escalation of the violence. I think is very telling.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a very good point.
I want to make. So the next point that I wanted to make was about. So you guys, we've talked about whether the violence is sort of it's making the news, yeah. And is the issue making the news, or is it just the violence and sort of the reaction to the violence what's making the news? Yeah, in this case, it's not the issues at all. Of course, as we know, we've been discussing that it's the violence and the police reaction, which is the headline. And for that matter, it appears that the violence was not justified in this case. In my opinion, I think that violence can be justified in protests, and there are scenarios where it can be used effectively. In this case, it felt more random and more as if people were trying to bring attention to themselves and to their actions of violence, and not that they were trying to press a certain issue or a certain cause. There are ways to be violent where you could focus more on the issue at hand as opposed to simply trying to hurt a specific police officer or trying to loot a supermarket.
Yeah.
That's my comment on it. It might be interesting to talk about what those ways might be, but I don't think that was the case here. And sorry, I'll stop for a sec, but one final point I wanted to make, because it was mentioned that where some of these protests sort of got their roots in this the WTO protests in Seattle in 1999. It's interesting in the media presentation that the peaceful protests, or at least the way people reacted peacefully, was one of the big stories that came out of that. One of the most famous pictures was a person handing a flower to a riot police officer, and all sorts of pictures of people doing sitting protests and being extremely peaceful and getting then kicked by police officers. Those were the pictures that sort of got that went around the world. As far as I remember, those were pictures that everyone saw of people handing flowers to police officers and so on, and seeing the police crack down on that brutally. I guess the point I wanted to make is there's a way to peacefully protest which can be effective, and that can get effectively portrayed in the media. And there's also there could be a violent way to do that as well, that could be effective in certain circumstances. The way we saw it here, it was clearly an ineffective way to violently protest.
I really want to add on that a lot of people were there rioting who don't have to do anything with politics. It was just a matter of the fact that it was an event for like a lot of people who were just coming here to experience something, because Germany is a country which is really quiet and people are just excited to see something, and if something happens and there's like a movement, they just join and they don't mind about the content of why they're doing it or not.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a big point to make.
Yeah, I mean, following up on that, I mean, that's why I prefer the word hooligan for these people. You know, much like, you know, football hooligans are not actually so interested in football. I mean, they have their team that they love, but really, you know, they're more interested in the violence that takes place after the football matches. I think a lot of the people who were committing acts of violence in Hamburg during the G20 were hooligans. They were not so interested in making a political point about something. They were more interested in participating in some chaos.
Well, then I think a little self-critique on all of us leftists is then Sean made a lot of good points, I think, that you can use violence in a way that's directed at a political goal, but you can also do this in peaceful ways. And I think as leftists we need to come onto the same page often and try to actually. Navas is shaking his head.
That's never happened.
Not the same thing.
That's never happened.
No, it's never
The Chinese hated the Russians.
Yeah, but I mean,
The Russians hated the South Americans.
They were communists with big scare quotes.
There are no communists ever. But we need to do this. I think.
Of course.
It hasn't happened, but we need to actually do this.
And I think one of the things we could talk about is what's happening now. I mean, I think the left party in Germany, at least, is being severely discredited.
Well, with that, we can go into the next question. Oh, okay, I'm getting hands. Okay,
Cool.
yeah.
I would just like to start with that, since I'm kind of into German politics.
Let me.
Yeah, just
the
like
question.
Introduce it and then
Yeah,
So
go for it.
it's like the response from the left, the political handling of the G20 protests, what the police did, and what parties said.
Okay, yeah.
Oh yeah, there we go. So the left-wing party in Germany is like one big party, which includes a lot of different opinions about political directions. And so the main problem they have, they're always in the parliament, basically. Not in all small states of Germany, but generally they are in the big parliament.
So we're talking about Die Linke.
Die Linke, so that's Die Linke.
the party we're trying to
Yeah,
the left.
exactly. So the left is always part of the parliament, but it doesn't get a lot of votes. So a lot of people I know are not voting at all because they don't agree to the whole communist background of this Die Linke party, which is kind of unfortunate. And a lot of normal people who would be social in their minds and would have like same directions in some ways, they don't vote for Die Linke because they don't take it seriously. They say that people from Die Linke are like uncontrolled and they don't really have a clue about what they're doing, which is referred to this whole many direction things inside of this party aspect. And I think that this thing which happened last weekend was so unfortunate for Die Linke because it just shows again, like, if you vote for Die Linke, then everything is going to escalate. They're just not able to organize something in a proper way. They will always have people who are like jumping out and yeah.
Just quickly, I'll let you go, Sean. I mean, Linke is a very new party. It's only since 2007. A lot of the people who were SPD went into the party, so, you know, the left branch of the SPD, and also a lot of maybe what you'd call former communists or Soviet, well, not Soviet, it's a German...
East Germany.
East Germans, yeah.
This was, thanks, Andrew. This was exactly the point I was going to make, just to mention that Die Linke, they are much more successful in the former Eastern Germany, which is interesting. That makes sense in a lot of ways.
Also more successful.
Yeah, exactly. So, and just a quick, but it's interesting the point that Jana made about people not taking them too seriously. And here's just a quick anecdote, but not an antidote. I don't have the antidote, but I do have an anecdote to share.
I like the antidote.
Which is
Give us the antidote.
which is that a colleague of mine who's from the East, and he's a very proud supporter of Die Linke. He now lives in Hamburg, so he lives in the West, and people tend to sort of rib him about it and give him and make jokes about it a little bit. And it's interesting because he's like some local party leader in his little section of some tiny village where he lives here. But he himself knows that he doesn't really take it seriously either. So he believes in he might call it socialism, or he might even say communism, but let's not give him too much credit for using that term. But he knows that it's not he doesn't consider it a serious thing, but he is proud that they are represented in the parliament here. And he himself is now associated with this sort of violence here, and this guy would in no way condone the violence, and is a member of this party because he supports the communist ideals that he grew up with in the East.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I think that Die Linke is living out of from the idea to say that we're an opposition party. So they're like the little guy in the parliament, which is just pushing you from the side over and over again, saying like, think of the people, which is an idea I really like. But in the eyes of the people, and also in my point of view, they're not really more than that.
Yeah.
But what could they be? I mean,
they could be, but they're not yet.
Yeah,
because
what could they be? I mean, if people are not going to vote for them, they're not going to be anything, right?
Yeah.
Then they're going to be the rabble-rousers who just create some noise in the parliament.
Yeah.
But I think that's still a very important job. I think let us not just ridicule them for doing the job. I think they have still occupy a space within the political spectrum that Germany is, right? And this is already a very important contribution, I think.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to say, so, I mean, we were talking about G20, now we're talking about the Linke.
Because that is where most of the pressure post G20 is coming
That's where
on.
the pressure is coming from.
To be fair, the media is interviewing leaders of Die Linke to get their reaction to this.
Okay.
For sure.
I just want to still bring it back a little to.
It is the G20, yeah. It is the
Talk a little bit
G20.
about the Rotaflora.
Yeah, exactly. So the guy who's the lawyer of the Road of Florida was a former Link politician. I mean, and now he distanced himself from both the things.
Did you call him the Lord of the Rotaflora?
No, the lawyer.
Lawyer.
Oh, the lawyer. Okay.
The
I heard
Lord.
Lord.
No, not the Lord.
Well, for a little bit of background, we may have mentioned it already, but Rotaflora is the sort of center for the autonomous left organizations in Hamburg. So that includes, I don't know, anything from the interventionist left to just, I don't know.
But you could say it's a center for all of Germany. In Hamburg for sure, but really it's a symbol all across Germany for people that are associated
I mean,
with
it's not really so much a center as it's a place where people come together.
Yeah,
It's an
that's right,
old
that's right.
occupied theater for
Yeah, it's an old occupied theater.
many years, and they tried to get the people out many times, and they never managed to
it's
do
an
it.
amazing
It's like
place.
the
It's a
community
of the radical left in Germany,
Resistance.
Yeah.
maybe in the world. But anyway, so they've issued a couple of statements, the Rotaflora, about this. First off, on Friday night, when the shit hit the fan in Schanze, and Rotaflora is right there on Schulterblatt on the main street in Schanze, they shut their doors and distanced themselves a little bit from the violence and said, "We're only letting injured people in." They immediately sort of read the situation and said, "Well, this is further than what we are prepared to sort of accept as." Part of our sort of ideological position, perhaps. But since then, they've also issued a number of statements. They've called for a sort of general assembly of the radical left in Hamburg to come and engage in some self-criticism about the violence, which I think is appropriate. And I think in general, they've shown that they are not particularly happy with the rioting and the looting and these things that went on in Hamburg. Also, since going back a little bit to the media coverage of things, since this has all happened and all of the violence portrayed in the media, there's been a number of people in Hamburg that are calling for now the dissolution of the Rotaflora, which I think is a crazy bad overreaction.
They always use any excuse
to try to get rid of the Rotaflora.
Yeah, but now they have evidence to it. I mean, now they say what happens if you let them be here. So
you have then more peace and prosperity.
no, you don't. No, you have
on the same subject, I'm not sure if you guys saw, but there was an interview with one of the press people who represents the autonomous left for the Rotaflora, who works there, and he was absolutely castigated from what he said in this interview because
he fucked up bad.
He basically said in this interview that he has some sympathy for the people that are committing the violent acts. I mean, this is a guy who shares some of their views, and he can understand that.
Did you say sympathy or?
He said sympathy. He said, at least in the interview that I saw, that he said that he can understand to a certain level what's causing people to commit some of these violent acts that they are committing, but if they're going to commit those acts, don't do it in the center for the autonomous left and destroy that neighborhood. Go out to the suburbs where the rich people live and destroy their neighborhoods. That's what he said in the gist, and of course
Well,
he was...
I agree with that on a certain
it's a very
level,
controversial
actually,
statement.
but that is a big slip up as well.
But he has retracted that. Yeah, he's the guy that I was talking about. I mean,
Yeah. Well, no, I mean, actually, that's. I guess that gets back to the media presentation of the protest. But I mean, that makes me wonder, like, how really, we call these the black bloc. For the same speaker questioned whether it's the black bloc who actually do that. Just to give a little background on the black bloc. I mean, they're not an organization. At any process, there can be a black bloc, or there can be many black blocs. These are groups of people, of individuals that should be stressed, that decide to dress up in black with black masks, usually, in order so that they cannot be identified, and also in order so that within a group of people who are similarly dressed, they cannot be pointed out later. And they usually seeking to fulfill certain goals that they made among themselves. So they're not a political organization, it's a strategy. And I think the way in the media it's been presented is that they're a political organization. Chell is going next.
Okay, so exactly. So they're not a political organization. They're not. There's no centralized sort of command and control structure,
Like Darth Vader or something.
Totally, and also the guy who gave the statement about from the world to Florida. I mean, he I think in the statement he also said that he's like a representative of the autonomous community, but you can't really have a representative of an autonomous community because it's a bunch of different groups.
Self-declared.
Yeah, self-declared.
Yeah, self-declared.
I mean, they don't see eye to eye on a lot of stuff, and they're autonomous groups. I mean, autonomous means autonomous there, and it's a big, it's a very large, collection of different groups. So if one person comes forward and says, "Hey, it's like reading the Twitter feed for like Antifa. Like who's giving that Twitter feed? It's like some 16-year-old in his basement. Nobody represents Antifa. So also, but there was another,
everybody represents that.
but there was another member from Rotofor that gave a speech, or not a speech, but gave an interview to the media, and his was, he did not say we should go burn down Blankenese. He was more, like, hey, this went too far, and the left needs to reflect on its actions and talk about this and discuss this sort of violence and come to
like we're doing right now in the podcast.
And just in the sense of saying everything that should be said on this subject, and about what that guy's quote was, that they should probably go and destroy other rich neighborhoods. I mean, Friday morning there were a huge group of people that were most likely part of the Black Bloc that did go to one of the richest streets in Hamburg.
Yeah, the Elbchaussee is.
we didn't talk about that.
Is actually the richest.
And
area,
it's probably one of the richest streets in all of Hamburg, and they walked down the street without any police confrontation whatsoever and burned cars and destroyed vehicles. And this was in the morning on Friday as people were heading to work.
And children were going to school. So let's not pretend like the only violence happened in this left-wing neighborhood of the Schanze.
It did happen in other areas. There were other streets, there were other neighborhoods that were affected as well. But I honestly think that goes to show you that, like Andrew said, this Black Bloc, it's more of a strategy. And in this case, the strategy was chaos. It was there was no leadership where they had some sort of a strategic plan about where they were going to commit violence. It was done more in a chaotic, random fashion.
Well, I mean, we're at 40 minutes again, so a second part. So I'm going to wind this down, but I do want to sort of come from another perspective, and that is. There has been a lot of criticism of the violence that has been happening at the protests, but I do want to point out that for the most part, everyone was peaceful, right?
Yeah.
But even the violent people, I do think they were having a goal. They're against the G20, and I just want to ask, if you're criticizing the G20 violence. Where were you at these protests if you weren't there? Because I feel that if there would have been a huge body of people out on the streets, these acts would not have been possible. I think that is the main part. I mean, of course, the violence happened at night, more or less, and so that's when people do go to bed. But still, I think if many more people came out to show, we are for peaceful protests, these acts of violence could not have happened. I think it takes a little legitimacy away from the people who are criticizing this violence.
I agree with that about with Andrew's point that they're giving more people to peacefully protest out there. If those people would sort of get off the couch, then that could make a difference, and it could perhaps lessen the need for the violent, or not really the need, lessen the amount of the violent protests. But I just want to make one final point, because we've been asking about when violence could be justified, and some of us, or at least myself, I've said that I think there is a situation, or there could be a scenario where it could be effective. But I've been thinking about what would that scenario be? Perhaps if we could imagine a scenario where the goal of the protesters was actually fulfilled, which was to block the protests. Perhaps we could imagine a way where the protesters could have gotten into the red zone, perhaps in a violent means, and somehow disrupted the actual G20 itself, in my opinion, that could, depending on how it was done, that could be a way for the violence to have been justified if that had accomplished their goal. Now that is sort of the ends. So the ends justifying the means, and I am sort of saying if it had been successful, then it would have been justified, which is sort of a silly thing to say. But in my mind, in retrospect, if they had successfully disrupted the summit, which was their goal, and that would have, the news story, at least the media's portrayal, would have then been quite different. It would have been about this G20 getting broken up by violent protesters, as opposed to the current story, which is the G20 went as planned. All the world leaders showed up, had their discussions, accomplished nothing. But the big story is the protests and how the police reacted to it. And that's the story, which is unfortunate that that's the story, and not that.
Really good point.
And not that.
Okay, well then I'm going to close this wonderful long podcast, this Stalin-esque length podcast, with we usually have a morale at the end of our podcasts, and this is a very short one. It's a quote from Bertolt Brecht, and it's very pertinent to what we've been talking about. And it is, quote, "What is the robbing of a bank compared to the founding of a bank?" And thank you very much for listening. This was Propaganda Podcast by The Moral Economy. Visit our website at www.mainstreamidea.com. We have a Facebook page called Propaganda Podcast, as well as The Moral Economy. Find us on Twitter. Find us, in iTunes. Where else can you find us, guys? I mean, I've been
Find us on the internet.
Yeah, find just Google, guys. I mean, it's
Google.
Yeah.
Or come over to Hamburg. It's beautiful.
Yeah, come to Hamburg.
You can be on our podcast.
Yeah, actually, our standards are very low.
Yeah.
Come. All right.
Stay critical.
Stay critical.
Yeah.
Stay critical.